This morning, find the book of Esther, Old Testament book. It's not as hard to find as Habakkuk. Did any of y'all ever not find that book while we were going through that series? That's a little bitty book. We're going to be in the book of Esther. In my Bible, it's page 761. That ought to get you in the neighborhood. Anyway, going to be about the next 10 weeks that we're going to be looking at the book of Esther. It is a wonderful book with just a lot of truths in it. And if you have never read the book of Esther, hopefully this morning will spark an interest in your doing that. And Brother William, while I'm thinking about it, I know years ago when I did this series, we closed this series with a video. And I'll get with you about finding that if we hadn't. A great video to close it with that we'll show. But for the next several weeks, we're going to look at the book of Esther and go through this book. This morning, we will cover chapter 1, but I want to kind of do as the title says and just set the stage for you and share some things about the book of Esther that maybe you didn't know, maybe you did know, but they're worth remembering and recollecting even if you do know. So, think about your day just this morning when you got up. Do you know that on an average, most of our days start out in what we would call just ordinary fashion? And maybe your morning did. I know some mornings don't register like that. But on an average, every day starts out as just an ordinary day. And that ordinary day can turn into something extraordinary, something that will change the entire course of your life. And I was reminded of that yesterday when I went and did a funeral for a 41-year-old lady that played on the state championship basketball team that I coached in 1996. 41 years old. About 3 years ago, was diagnosed with a form of cancer that she just couldn't overcome. And it finally overcame her back last Tuesday, I think it was. But, there are things like that. The death of a loved one, the birth of a child, a disease that changes an ordinary day and a trip to the doctor's office. It changes the course of your life. I wrote down here some biblical examples of that, where it started out as an ordinary day and then turned into something extraordinary. I wrote down here Noah and the flood. God had told Noah it was going to rain, and Noah wakes up that morning, probably sky's cloudy, it starts sprinkling. And that ordinary day turned into an extraordinary event, didn't it? Because everything, the whole earth, the whole world was flooded. There's the story of Moses and the burning bush. When Moses encounters that bush that day, it was just another day for Moses when he woke up. And at age 80, Moses' life divided into 3 40-year time frames. But at age 80, God speaks to him at the burning bush. Moses walks up on that bush and it's burning and it's not consumed. And then there's the story of David becoming the next king of Israel. Do you remember where he was when he finally got word? He was tending sheep in his father's pasture. And remember, Samuel comes over and he's asking Jesse about all his kids, and he begins with the oldest, and he's working his way down and he still hadn't found him. And so he asked Jesse, do you have any more children? And Jesse said, yeah, I got a son that's taking care of the sheep, but he's no count for. And guess what? He was a count for. He was Israel's next appointed king by the name of David. And then it gets a little more dramatic. It was just an ordinary day when Jesus was born, wasn't it? The promised seed to be our Savior. There wasn't anything special about that day other than the fact that Jesus was born. And listen, when he was born that morning, it set in motion the fact that the world would never be the same. So Jesus is born, He lives His life, Then Jesus is crucified and He dies. The guards are guarding the tomb because they didn't want Jesus' body stolen, or so they thought. And it was just another ordinary morning when God said, you know what? It's time for you to come on back, son. And on the third day, the tomb is rolled away. And again, I tell you, we preach on that every Easter. The tomb wasn't rolled away so that Jesus could get out. The tomb was rolled away so that the people could get in. Jesus didn't need any help getting out. And He came out of that tomb. And then the last illustration, and this one hadn't happened yet. But you think about when Jesus comes back. And I trust that everybody who has ever sat under the sound of my voice will be saved. Probably not, but that's just a hope. But you know, one day Jesus is going to return to earth. And you know what? It may happen on what was an ordinary morning this morning. We got up, we got dressed, we came to church. And if it doesn't happen today, guess what? The kids may wake up in the morning, get dressed for school, and we may drop them off at school, we may go to work, and somewhere in the midst of that day, God may say, son, go get your children. But there's coming a day where that's going to happen. And maybe it starts out as an ordinary morning that turns into a very extraordinary event, whether you're saved or lost. If you're saved, you're gone. If you're not saved, you're going through what the Bible calls a 7-year tribulation period, which this world has never seen. And listen, as horrible as that time will be, do you know there's something worse than that? It's dying and stepping out into eternity without Jesus Christ. You know, the great thing about doing that funeral yesterday, I knew that Melanie knew the Lord. She was a Christian. She went to heaven the moment she drew her last breath. And that's the end for all of us who are Christians. But that day's coming. And the story of Esther, the same thing happens here. It's a young, orphaned girl who has no connection with the most powerful man in the world, the king. And she doesn't know what's fixing to transpire. But you know what God's doing? God's taking the life of Esther and the life of this Persian Empire king, and He's weaving them together. And you'll see that in the story. He's weaving these two lives together until they become joined, as Esther becomes the new queen. And as she basically saves the Jewish nation. But it started out just as an ordinary day. There's 4 things that I want to share with you, and then we'll get into the story here. But there's 4 things about the book of Esther. You may know these, you may not. Number 1 is, it's one of 2 books in the Old Testament that's named after a woman. You know what the other one is? Ruth. Good job. William pays attention sometimes. Ruth and Esther, the 2 books in the Old Testament named after a woman. Second thought about the book of Esther, it's never quoted from in the New Testament. You go through all the way through, you'll never see a quote from the book of Esther. Isn't that amazing? Especially when you know what a powerful, awe-inspiring book it is, but it's never quoted in the New Testament. And these last 2 will really get you. Do you know that prayer is never mentioned in the book of Esther? Not once is prayer mentioned in this book that we're about to embark upon. And here's the last one. It's more awe-inspiring than that one. The name of God is never mentioned in the book of Esther. Not even a pronoun reference to it. And you think, how in the world can that book be in the Bible then? When we unpack the truths that are here, you'll see why. But it's named after a woman. It's not mentioned in the Old Testament, not quoted in the New Testament. Prayer's never mentioned, not even once. And the name of God is never mentioned, not even a pronoun reference to God. And yet, it's a book of the Bible, and it's one of the most awesome books in all of Scripture. Isn't that amazing? Now, let me give you 2 reasons that Esther's important. 2 reasons the book of Esther is important. Number 1, it shows what happened to the Jews in Persia. And this story will unfold, but there was a man by the name of Haman that you'll be introduced shortly in this book. And he wanted to wipe out a Jew in particular named Mordecai. And because of some things that transpired between a conflict that they had, Haman just decided to wipe out the whole Jewish nation. He wanted them all gone. And the book of Esther tells what happened to these Jews who were in Persia during this time. A second reason that Esther is important is because of what's known as the Feast of Purim. Purim. And that was a feast that celebrated what God did for His people, the Jews, that Haman couldn't do. Haman wanted to destroy him, and God said, no, you're not. That's not going to happen. And long story short, Haman gets wiped out instead of the Jews. And the Feast of Purim reminds us, it's a celebration of what God did for His people. Man, you and I have reason to celebrate every day, don't we? You're breathing, your little ticker is still ticking, your heart's still beating, you're able to see and hear and feel and enjoy relationships. Man, we can just go on and on. We have reason to celebrate because of what Jesus has done for us through the cross. The purpose of the book of Esther is found in chapter 4 and verse 14. Okay? Look at what Esther 4:14 says. It's close to halfway through the book. But Mordecai is talking to Esther, and he's laying out before Esther the plan that, hey, we're fixing to get wiped out. And guess what, Esther? She's the queen at this time now. And he's telling Esther, just because you're the queen doesn't mean that all the Jews are going to get wiped out except for you. You're going to be in that number. And so Mordecai's going to Esther and he's telling her this because he knows she can intervene. And here's what he says to Esther. For if altogether you hold your peace at this time, in other words, he's telling Esther, you got to go to the king. If you don't go to the king, we're fixing to get wiped out. But he's telling Esther, if you don't do it, then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise for the Jews from another place. And then he makes this astounding statement. Go back just a little bit, William. There you go. I forgot the last few words. But you and your father's house will be destroyed. And then he says this to Esther, and it's a verse for us. But who knows whether you are come to the kingdom for such a time as this. In other words, Esther, I think God put you here at this time for this purpose to save the Jewish nation. And you know what? Man, you look at that and you think, boy, she was very important. Let me let you in on a side note. So are you. You are very important to God. You are sitting on a pew in Victory Hill Baptist Church this morning for such a time as this. Whatever you do tomorrow, you'll be doing it for such a time as this. God's put confidence in you and empowered you through His Holy Spirit for such a time as this. Your life's important. You matter to God as much as Esther did, as much as Mordecai did, as much as anybody did. And we don't look at life a lot of times that way, do we? That's why we stay depressed and strung out and wore out and ready to give up. We don't see our life like that. Listen, you are as important as Esther this morning, male or female. You are. God's got a plan for your life. God's got a calling. God's got a purpose. And it's for such a time as this. And when we begin to view our life that way, we realize that we can make a difference. That we can make a difference in somebody or somebody's life or lives. You're important. You're not just a human being that faces life every day, that goes through the motions of waking up, doing my thing, and going to bed. You matter to God. You know what the proof of that statement is? 2,000 years ago on the cross of Calvary, God sent Jesus for you. A nobody who was going to ever amount to anything apart from Jesus. God looked at your life, knew your life before He sent Jesus. He knew every wrong mistake you would make. He knew every sin you would ever commit. He knew every time you'd tell Him no. And you know what God did in response to that? He still sent Jesus. Isn't that amazing? That He would look at your life and mine and say, boy, Satan would remind God every day, why are you sending Jesus? He's a loser. He's never going to amount to anything in life, and you're going to send Jesus to pay for his sins? You know what God said? Yeah, I am. I'm going to do that. Because I'm going to put Him there for such a time as this. And I'm going to use His life or her life for my glory and my good. I see value in him. I see value in her. I want that individual to make a difference for me. That's what should light a fire under us to go out into the world tomorrow and not live like Jesus is still on the cross or in the grave. He's not. And there's victory in Jesus. The story of Esther brings all this out. Now, Esther chapter 1. This is how Esther gets involved. Okay? I'm not going to read all these verses. I trust that you will go home and read through chapter 1 today when you especially know what's going to happen in it. I'm going to tell you what's going to happen in it, and you go home and read it, and maybe it'll make sense to you. But I want to pick out some of these verses and read them for you this morning. Esther chapter 1. Look at verse 1, because this verse, it's another king living out another day in another year of his life. That's how this story starts. Look at verse 1. It came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus. This is Ahasuerus, which reigned from India even to Ethiopia, over 127 provinces. It's just another ordinary day in another ordinary king's life. Okay? Nothing jumps out at you in verse 1. The rest of the book will. But it's just another ordinary day. Now, I won't read the rest of these, but let me summarize for you verses 2 through 15, okay? Mainly because some of these names in here I can't pronounce, and you'd laugh at me if I tried. But let me break the next verses down for you. We don't have them up on the wall, but just listen. Verses 2 through 4, this king Ahasuerus puts on a feast. And for the next 180 days, he's putting his wealth and his power on display for everybody to see. That's what's going to take place for about the next 6 months. Okay? And the purpose of it is to discuss going to war with the Greeks. And he's going to put on display all his power and majesty for the people to see. In verses 5 through 8, we're told that there is a 7-day banquet in the king's garden for everybody to come enjoy. It is not a banquet I would let my children go to. And as a parent in this church, you wouldn't let yours either. Because you know why? Long story short, everybody there is going to get wasted. Okay? All they want to drink, all the fun they want to involve in, that's what's about to take place in the king's garden. From the smallest to the greatest, come and drink till you die. Open for anybody. No limits. Okay? Then in verses 9 through 11, it is the pivotal moment in the story of Esther. Okay? Vashti is the queen. Okay? Ahasuerus is the king. Vashti is the queen. Vashti is going to throw her own party. For the women, all the men have gone with Ahasuerus. Drink up, boys. Vashti has her own party. Well, in the midst of these two parties, there's a very pivotal moment in this story. Because Ahasuerus sends for Vashti. He wants the queen to come, and he wants to display his queen to all these guys. And I don't think he's doing it in a very good way, and I think Vashti knows that. I think she knows what's coming. Word comes to Vashti, hey, the king wants you. And she's thinking, all of them's drunk, all of them's wasted, and the king wants me to come over there? I don't think so. Notice verse 12. Esther chapter 1, verse 12. But the queen, Vashti, did what? Refused to come at the king's commandment by his chamberlains. Therefore was the king very wroth. It's a mild way of saying he was ticked off. He didn't like it. She needs to come. I've told her to come. And his anger burned in him. Vashti's not coming. And you know those guys dreaded going back and telling him that. They're thinking she's supposed to come. She's not coming. She's not coming at your beckon and command. And so they go back to tell the king this. How does he respond? He's mad about it. She has every right not to go for the reasons in which he wants her to come. She's not going. So now I want to read for you verses 16 through 22 and see what happens. Because the king asked his men, what am I supposed to do? Vashti's not going to come. Let's begin in verse 16. Read down through the end of the chapter. Okay? It says in verse 16, and Memucan, not a very intelligent man, and probably a man who's having trouble in his own marriage at home. Memucan answered before the king and the princes, Vashti the queen hath not done wrong to the king only. This is what he's thinking and saying. But also to all the princes and all the people that are in all the provinces of the king Ahasuerus. For this deed of the queen shall come abroad unto all women, so that they shall despise their husbands in their eyes when it shall be reported. In other words, once they find out what Vashti's done, every woman's going to do that to their husband. We're not doing anything else you tell us to do. The king Ahasuerus commanded Vashti the queen to be brought in before him, but she came not. Likewise, shall the ladies of Persia and the Medes say this day unto the king's princes, which have heard of the deed of the queen, thus shall there arise too much contempt and wrath. If it please the king, this is what they're going to suggest, because Vashti wouldn't come. If it please the king, let there go a royal commandment from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, that it be not altered. In other words, king, when you write what we're suggesting, it can't change. It's written in blood. You can't change it. And here it is. Here's what they're suggesting be written. That Vashti come no more before King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal estate unto another that is better than she. You get the picture? You know what they're telling Ahasuerus to do? Get rid of her. She's not worthy to be queen. Why? Because she wouldn't come at your beck and command. And when all the other women in the palace figure this out, and in the province, they're going to do what Vashti did. There's going to be an uproar. And the men are going to become slaves to the women. That's what Memucan is fearful of. Because, look, it's not right at his house either. You gather this from what he's sharing. It says in verse 20, and when the king's decree, which he shall make, shall be published throughout all the empire, they're telling the king, if you sign this decree, this is what will happen. For it's great, all the wives shall give their husbands honor, both to great and small. And the saying did what? Please the king and the princes. I mean, hey, they're all in. They're afraid the women are going to take over. So we got to come up with a plan that's going to keep them under submission in a bad way. And the king did according to the word of Memucan. He did what this knucklehead suggested. Okay? For he sent letters into all the king's provinces, into every province according to the writing thereof, and to every people after their language, that every man should bear rule in his own house, and that it should be published according to the language of every people. Now, it's worth noting that while all this is playing out, Esther is clueless. She doesn't know what's transpiring in the palace. She doesn't know Vashti's fixing to be booted out. And they're going to have this big old collage of women that's going to vie for the next queen of Persia. She doesn't know any of this is going on. She doesn't know the king's fixing to sign this law that's fixing to mandate that all these women bow to their husbands. She doesn't know any of this is going on. Guess what? It's just another ordinary day for Esther. She didn't know any of this is going on. She's in her own world doing her own little thing like you and I stay most of the time. And we'll pick up next week, and I want you to read this chapter, but read chapter 2. But I want to close this morning with just 3 practical points, okay? That's kind of the setting and the background to where the story's headed. Vashti's fixing to get booted out. We got to find a new queen. We got to find somebody. And only God knows what's going to happen. We know because we read the story. But God knows. God has a plan. But here's the 3 practical takeaways as we get into Esther. Number 1, God is present even when we do not recognize His presence. Remember what I told you, one of the 4 main things about Esther? God's not mentioned in this book. Not even a pronoun reference to Him will you find in this book. Look at what Isaiah 55 verses 8 through 11 say. God says this, "My thoughts are not your thoughts, my ways are not your ways, says the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, my thoughts higher than your thoughts. For as the rain cometh down, and the snow from heaven, and returneth not thither, but watereth the earth, and maketh bring forth and bud, that it may give seed to the sower, and bread to the eater. So shall my word be that goeth forth out of my mouth. It shall not return unto me void, but it shall accomplish that which pleaseth, and it shall prosper in the things whitherto I send it." You don't hear God saying any of that in this book, in this chapter, but you'll see it. You'll see God all over every page in this book and in this story. And He's present when we don't know it. How many times have you been at work doing your thing, or on the athletic field doing your thing, or at home doing your thing, and you don't even realize God's within 1,000,000 miles? You know what? He is. He is very, very present in your life. There's times we wish He weren't. So I could put God on a shelf and go out with my buddies that do things they shouldn't do. And you know what? Maybe God won't know about it. Yes, God knows about it. Gabe just went off to Mississippi State this weekend. That's what I told Gabe in a text yesterday. Son, God's with you every step of the way. If you choose right, He's with you. If you choose wrong, He's with you. He's there. He knows. Number 2, God uses the saved and the lost to accomplish His will. Did you know that? God doesn't just use saved people. God uses wicked people in this story like Haman to accomplish His will. He uses Ahasuerus. He used people like Saddam Hussein. He used people like Adolf Hitler. You know why? Because He's God. He uses the saved and the lost to accomplish what He wants done. And here's number 3. God always, always, always has a purpose in what He allows or causes. He has a purpose for everything. He's sovereign God. Now let me tell you this. God doesn't cause everything, and God doesn't allow everything, but He causes or allows everything. He's in control. God calls all the shots. Things in your life are there because He's caused it specifically and directly to happen, or indirectly He's allowed it to happen. Remember the story of Job? Satan wanted to get to him, but guess what? He had to go sit in the chair right in front of God and say, okay, do I have permission to do this? God gave him permission to touch him, but not kill him. And it's the same in your life. Satan can't do one thing to you that God doesn't allow to happen to you. And it's true. What does Romans 8:28 say? We know that God causes how many things? All things to work together for good to those who love Him, to those who are the called according to His purpose. Now let me tell you this. Let me tell you what this verse doesn't say. I've shared this with you before. All things are not good. The death of a loved one, that's not good. Melanie dying yesterday, that wasn't good. We would think. All things are not good, and God doesn't cause all things. But God does cause all things to work together for good. Philippians 1:6. Being confident of this very thing, that He which hath begun a good work in you will perform it until the day of Jesus Christ. How do I know that? Because He's sovereign. He's in control of everything and every event of your life. This will unfold in the book of Esther. Ahasuerus is having a party. Vashti is having a party. Ahasuerus wants Esther to come to the party, and she said no. The king signs this decree that she's out. Now we begin to look for a new queen. Who will it be? Anybody want to take a wild guess on who the new queen's going to be? Might be Esther, yeah. And God's got a plan for that. You know she's the queen. She's the queen to be. And let's watch the rest of the story unfold. Let's pray. Father, thank You for the book of Esther. And thank You that even though your name's not mentioned, not even a pronoun to it, not even prayer, You are all over it. Thank You for that. You're sovereign. You're God. And Lord, the truths that are there are the truths that are true in our life. You're present when we don't know it. You use the saved and the lost to accomplish Your will, and You have a purpose for everything. Thank You for that. Thank You that every person in here this morning, even the kids in children's church, are vastly important to You. And the cross demonstrates that. The empty tomb demonstrates that. Your coming back demonstrates that. And Lord, may every person this morning not let them leave knowing that they're vastly important. For those who do not know Jesus, Lord, would You give me a minute to explain the plan of salvation to them? For those who need to come to the altar and pray, You take this time of invitation and use it for Your glory in Jesus' name.